Okay, we're live.
Okay, we're going to try this again. Take two. Welcome. And we are with Dr. Clark Wernicke of the Galt Archaeological School of Research. And my name is Cindy Oser. We have with us today Dr. Clark Wernicke. We also have Lee Greenthaner, and she is our digital video specialist. We will listen to Dr. Wernicke. If you've got any comments or questions, if you will put it in the comments section, and Lee will go ahead and read the questions, and then she will go ahead and relay it back to Dr. Wernicke. Let me give you a little bit intro. He has been so patient today. Dr. Wernicke is the project director for the Prehistory Research Project at the University of Texas in Austin and executive director of the Gault School of Archaeological Research. It's a nonprofit dedicated to research and education regarding the earliest peoples in the Americas. So we're going to find out, hopefully, who was here before us. Dr. Wernicke, he started his academic career with a degree in history from SMU, followed by an MBA from Northwestern University, an MA in anthropology from Florida Institute, and finally his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. He came back to archaeology after career in business, but why? No, I'm kidding. And has worked in the Middle East, Mesoamerica, the American Southeast and Southwest, and Texas. So Dr. Wernicke's primary specialty is that of archaeological project management, but he has also written extensively on architecture and Paleo-Indian art. So we're in for a great treat. Before I give the speaker over to him, I just wanted to remind you that if you need to show that you were here, make sure you go to the library website and go to the events and register for this event. So I'm done with speaking. Dr. Wernicke, it's time for you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. I am going to be speaking today basically in two parts. The first part, we're going to play a movie that we put together at Galt about the people of the Americas. And the second part is a little talk I'm going to do with PowerPoint, talking about the Galt site here in Texas and how that reflects locally. And then I'd be happy to answer as many questions as you've got at the end of this, as I mentioned. So first, we're going to start with the movie, and hopefully, if everything goes off without a hitch, you should be able to see this right away as I get to it. So, here we go. And it doesn't show on my screen, of course not. And of course, we're having a minor difficulty.
Well,
that's okay.
If you want to, give it.
For some reason, it doesn't show on my screen here. Okay, we should be okay. Try this.
If not, go ahead and give me the screen. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Yay!
Billions of people populate the Western Hemisphere. This enormous landmass is home to an incredibly diverse melting pot of individuals, each with a personal history that shapes his or her identity. Each of us compelled to better understand who we are.
Why is everybody going to Ancestry.com or 23andMe and getting their genetics done? They're curious about their history, their own history. And they want to go back as far as they can. They want to see everything they can see. Why is that important? Well, that's part of who we are. It's part of our makeup.
But what if we go back to our original ancestors, those first immigrants to set foot in the Americas? What was it like to first explore the vast expanse of open landscapes and hunt the abundant game stretching across the continent? And how did they get here? That was no easy task. Picture, if you will, the last vestiges of the Ice Age, when miles of glaciers formed a frozen wall to the north of the continent. A daunting horizon of ocean awaited at every shore. And yet, our ancestors made their way from Asia and possibly Europe into the continent in spite of these obstacles. How?
It's one of our last frontiers in archaeology, is when did people finally colonize the entire globe? And hemisphere, North and South America, is the very edge of that frontier.
It's a complex puzzle, but a team of scientists at the Prehistory Research Project at Texas State University, working in conjunction with the Galt School of Archaeological Research, is determined to find answers. They look to the stone tools these early peoples left behind for the clues. The stone technology our ancestors produced tells a story of the life they lived.
The challenge of archaeology is to take the scraps that people left behind and try to reconstruct what their lifeways were like, what the environments they occupied were like, and really get a comprehensive understanding of the human evolutionary story.
So knowing how people reacted, how they adapted, can tell us something about ourselves.
Although the Galt School sponsors research around the globe, its main focus and some of the most profound evidence regarding the peopling of the Americas has been excavated from its namesake, the Gault Archaeological Site. Located near the town of Florence, Texas, Galt is a repository of one of the most significant Paleo-Indian tool sets in the Americas, containing both Clovis and pre-Clovis artifacts. The site has drawn our ancestors to its remarkable qualities for thousands of years.
Galt is such a nice place. It has the food resources, it has the tool resources, it has the water resources, that everybody came there eventually.
You have chert, you have raw material for making stone tools. You're right on what we call an ecotone. So it's a boundary between many different kinds of environments. So you have resources from a lot of different places. There's like pecan trees, you have mammoths, you have deer.
These folks came to the Galt site already having a pretty good understanding of the landscape. If you're near water and stone tool materials, you've got everything you need to set up a life.
Dr. Michael Collins has spearheaded the excavation and research at the Galt site for almost years. He made the extraordinary commitment to purchase the site with his own funds and immediately donated the site to the Archaeological Conservancy.
Galt is a remarkable place in a lot of ways, and the very long period of time that people kept coming back there is one indication of that. And we think we have excavated something less than 3% of the archaeological volume of that site, and we have over 2.5 million artifacts.
And when you give tours of the site and you start reciting it, every once in a while you go, wow, 2.6 million artifacts approximately from about 3% of the site. That's hardly scratching the surface.
You can go around in the Americas and find Clovis artifacts in lots of places, and maybe if you studied dozens of them together, you could amass a similar kind of record, but there's no single site that shows so much detail as this one.
And we have technology that predates the Clovis culture. Now that tells you that people were in Texas a lot earlier, 16 to 18,000 years ago.
We've got 150,000 more or less artifacts stratigraphically beneath Clovis with luminescence dating back to close to 16,000 years. You've got Clovis, and then you've got a stratigraphic break with almost nothing in it. And then here's this new, what we're calling the Galt assemblage. We have a very strong case for an older than Clovis component. And there's nothing in between. There's nothing in the late Paleo-Indian or the Clovis or that sterile zone to indicate stuff's moving down through the stratigraphic section. We've got this little package of time and space at the Galt site that archaeologically is different and distinctive. It's not the same old, same old.
Sites like Galt and others in North, Central, and South America raise numerous questions regarding long-held paradigms of human migration.
The story that we had for a long time fit really well. It was like this beautiful archaeological hypothesis.
The one that we were all taught as children, the one that's still in a lot of elementary school textbooks is, 13,500 years ago, you have these half-naked guys in Siberia. They're hunting mammoth and following around. And one day they come to a bridge that connects Siberia and Alaska, a land bridge.
So during the last ice age, all of that water globally is locked up into these ice sheets, into these glaciers. And so that actually lowers the sea level globally and exposes a lot of land. And so it exposes this land between Siberia and Alaska.
They apparently come to a 3-mile-high wall of ice, the Cordilleran and Laurentian glaciers.
And then they went through this little, ice-free corridor, came down, and then Clovis happened, and then, there's the story.
They walked into an empty, at least empty of humans, continent, loaded with big game, and they could just spread very rapidly with no interference. And that's why you find Clovis all over the place. Well, the fly in that ointment is we've got these sites that are older than Clovis, and they're popping up in various environments.
That idea of peopling just no longer holds up to scrutiny. We have older sites, we have older material, we have different material that doesn't look like Clovis, and just it no longer stands the test of what our science and what our evidence is showing to us.
We find sites like Monteverde, which has good evidence for people down there at least 14,300 years ago, perhaps 18,000 years ago, and it's at the other end of this hemisphere. So people were here a lot earlier than they could have walked here.
The Bering Land Bridge ice-free corridor paradigm doesn't work anymore. We are beginning to see these other bits and pieces of evidence to the contrary, but nobody has yet pulled together a coherent new paradigm.
So the two hypotheses that are out there now is one, which they call the Kelp Highway, is people coming along the Pacific coast, perhaps bouncing along the coast in boats. And certainly there's a lot of DNA evidence from later that a lot of people came from what's now Asia. The other one is called the Solutrean hypothesis and argues that people might have come along the ice front from what's now Spain and southern France and come to the east coast of what's now the United States.
It is an oversimplification to say that it's either this route or it's this route. There's a lot more complexity now in the early record to do with the timing of the arrival, the route of the arrival, and what we're starting to understand, although we don't necessarily have direct evidence for everything, is that there are multiple routes. There are probably multiple timings.
The idea that you're gonna have the one path that everybody followed is kind of crazy. It's too simple in a way. The more we learn about humans, the more complicated it gets.
The peopling of the Americas has been a very long process, and it has as many pieces to it as the biggest, baddest jigsaw puzzle you ever saw.
Regardless of how these early people migrated into the continent, understanding how they adapted to their environment requires careful and detailed analysis of the tools they left behind.
There's a lot more to this than I went out with a trowel and scraped the ground. Digging up artifacts is one of the easiest things that archaeologists do. But for every day you do that, there might be 40 days in the lab, because figuring out what all of that means is a whole different thing.
A large part of our understanding of early peoples is gathered from carefully analyzing what is known as depotage, the flakes and fragments they left behind when making their stone tools.
That's actually a moment in time that a human struck that flake off and sure discarded it to the ground, but that little flake, I think, can tell you more about human behavior than the actual artifact that they make.
What you try to do with depotage analysis is you pull out artifacts that have platforms or identifying features on them. And so if they're using hammerstones or billets or antlers, if they're applying a lot of force or a little bit of force, then you can see all of that. It's kind of recorded on the flakes.
We have multiple lines of evidence when we do lithic analysis that not only do we know how they were made, we also know what they were used for and what they were doing. And these activities make it a very human story. They were scraping hide and bone, probably to get marrow out of them. They were using perforating tools, which means they were using tools to pierce hide. They were also slicing or butchering meat. And it's basically the same kind of toolkit that you'll find in a lot of archaeological stone tool cultures.
Another strategy archaeologists use to understand ancient peoples is by replicating the tools they crafted from stone, a process known as flint knapping.
It's helpful to get into replicating the behaviors that went into manufacturing prehistoric technologies. And the closer that we can get to that, then we have more to say about that prehistoric story. So this is the essence of flint knapping from a research-oriented standpoint. Going closer.
A lot of our materials that we collect from the site are flakes, the debitage and debris from stone tool manufacture. One of the things that's kind of becoming more well known in the studies is to try to refit pieces. And so I've got some examples here. So this would be a technological refit. And here you see this flake was found kind of further up in our stratigraphy. And we have a little bifacial piece here that was found a little bit lower, but you can kind of see why we thought, oh, these might actually go together. Just looking at the shape and the color, as well, and they kind of seamlessly fit together, kind of like a puzzle piece.
When I look at the debitage that I make, and I can look at mine and make a comparison, say, okay, not only does the final product look like the prehistoric thing, but also the flake debris looks like what we find in archaeological sites and assemblages. And that's when we know we're closer to those behaviors.
It allows us to think more in sort of an anthropological way. We can try to think about people as humans solving problems in their environment. And that's really a sort of a big thing that we can try to get out of this.
If you know how to really analyze stone tools, you can get, it's like peeling an onion of a lot of behaviors. So it's fantastic.
Archaeologists also rely on sophisticated imaging technologies such as X-ray fluorescence spectrometry. This scanning tool allows them to compare the soil and mineral content of various artifacts to surmise their place in the stratigraphy.
But what we're really looking for is we're looking for some of these smaller peaks in the spectrum.
Well, there's a peak in calcium.
Right. Okay, so now what we can do is we can compare the Pre-Clovis sample with some of the Elevate sample.
Archaeologists can better understand the geography of an archaeological site by using geographic information system technology as well. They can analyze the movement of water and soils across that landscape over time and how this impacts the artifacts within the soils.
Where this line is, so the trench, and then it looks like the gap is right in this area right here.
That's what makes archaeology just absolutely fascinating. Archaeology is a science that borrows the theories, methods, and findings of every single intellectual pursuit on the planet.
All those little things give us clues. And you have to put them all together and get experts in each of those fields to put them all together to come up with a final picture.
If you take the stratigraphic depths below Clovis, so this is made up of all these little flakes that are down there in the very bottom.
In order for the research to be accepted by the scientific community, it is essential that archaeologists adhere to specific protocols, otherwise known as rules of evidence.
As archaeologists, we consider ourselves to be scientists. So when we're looking for sites or for archaeological records that can help us overturn these stories or kind of poke holes in different arguments that people have made, we do have this kind of a couple lines of evidence that we look for.
If you've got something that you think is older than Clovis, what would determine that? And what would be acceptable to your peers? I say, well, in the case of older than Clovis, we want to find unmistakably human artifacts. We want to find excellent stratigraphy. We want the geology to show that stuff has been buried and sat there since a certain time.
You have to have good context, and that's what, for us as archaeologists, that you know exactly that's where people have left it, or you can explain how those stone tools or other material objects got there.
We want to have excellent dating that shows exactly how old that is. And, you know, if you get those things together, then everybody goes, okay, yeah, those are human. They were definitely found there, and they were definitely made there, and they were definitely buried 16,000 years ago. Then you've got an agreement.
So you have to have all that combined with one site isn't gonna change the story. One site can't really overturn, years and years of other scientists or scientists saying what we think. No, we know what happens. You look for patterns as archaeologists, patterns in human behavior and human culture.
We want to find other sites with further evidence, and there's other researchers. We're not the only ones doing this.
I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and we don't find the exact same materials here, but we find things that sort of look like the archaeological materials we find at the Galt site. So what I want to know is, how similar are they? How different are they? Are we talking about the same ideas or same peoples? And what we were trying to do with using these digital approaches was to make it that the sharing would be more widespread. That is, a digital model can be shared by everybody around the world.
Can we put together different sites and say, well, these technologies look similar, they may be connected, whereas these sites look different, they might not be connected. And I think that goes to increasing our knowledge of this period, but also highlighting the complexity. You have the Western STEM tradition on the Pacific coast. You have the mammoth kill sites in the Great Plains. Down here in Texas, sort of on those peripheries, you have the Gault assemblage. And then when you move over to the eastern seaboards and to the Atlantic, you have these small lanceolate points. You see all the way from Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania through to Cactus Hill in Virginia and Page Lanson in Florida. So you've got almost 4 patterns in North America alone.
The Galt site is one of many projects. So we've done a lot of projects here in Texas. We've done projects elsewhere. We did a mammoth site in Guatemala, a cave in Belize. We recently did work on Huaca Prieta in Peru, lithic analysis for Monteverde in Chile. We're interested in the peopling of this hemisphere, not the peopling of Texas.
What is the story our ancestors are telling us? The Galt School will continue to gather the clues and to engage both the academic and general public to bring our shared history to life. Perhaps we will gain a better understanding of our place in the arc of history.
One of the absolute fundamental obligations we have as professional archaeologists is to learn about the materials that we've recovered, learn about the context of those materials at the site, and share that with 2 audiences. One of them is our professional colleagues, and one of them is the interested general public.
Yeah, you touched a Columbian mammoth.
Dr. Collins is really unique in this way that he brings everybody in and can present it to the public in a way that, why it's important and why archaeology really matters.
That's a real good example.
Nice digging, you.
Yeah.
Very well done. Good job.
It's part of that shared collective past that we all have. And you can come and excavate, you can come and see how it happens. And then, maybe share a little bit about your own perspective about what might have happened in the past too.
We actually were able to acquire the Galt site and then donate it to the Archaeological Conservancy, which is a nonprofit that protects archaeological sites nationwide, some 500 of them. And we've administered and maintained the site for them. And we have trails out there, and we give tours. We have monthly scheduled tours, and we schedule lots of tours for schools and everything in between that.
We had over 2,000 volunteers who came in. We trained them how to excavate. So as an organization, our mission is about education, is about teaching.
We train people to understand not only what archaeology is, but why it's important.
You're not just looking at a book and just hunting something on a page. You're actually being able to pick it up and see it, to identify it.
I'm overwhelmed with emotion when I see that face with the kids holding that projectile point for the first time. There is no other feeling in the world.
You always have to take a moment as you're removing, that flake from the lowest levels and realize that you're holding something that, has been in the dirt for 16,000 years, that no one has seen or handled in 16,000 years. And, this isn't just, a piece of rock, but this is actually something that was struck off or produced to make a tool, it sort of really puts it into perspective, the time depth of humans on this planet.
Wow, guys, this is a fantastic find.
When you look at these tools, you're not just looking at a tool like, oh, what was it used for? But you're looking at the life of that person. What was he doing at the time when he made this tool, when he used the tool? What was his civilization or his group doing? Not just studying their technology, but you're studying them as individuals.
And even if it's not directly your culture, it's the human culture. So therefore it has meaning. It doesn't matter if you're not Native American or not. It doesn't matter if you're Black, if you're Asian. This matters because this is us.
And tell us something about where we're going as a society in the future. Not tomorrow, not next year, but 100 years, 1,000 years. What kind of things are we going to have to deal with? Galt is an important building block in that understanding.
And that's the best part about history, is it's stories that have happened. Stories like this. It's the story of humankind. It's mind-blowing.
Okay, I'm back. We are going to look at a little PowerPoint now. We talked a little bit in the film about the peopling of the Americas and how archaeologists work. And now we're going to kind of bring it home and show you why what's happening in Central Texas is so important. So here we go again. All right. Currently, there's what's known as a paradigm shift going on in the archaeology of the first peoples in the Americas. We've disproved old hypotheses and are just starting to come up with new models for testing. And the story we all learned in school, and unfortunately we still teach to fourth graders, is a very old one. It started in 1590 when a Jesuit priest named Jose de Acosta wrote a bestseller about his 15 years in the New World. It was called The Natural and Moral History of the Indies. It was a real page turner, believe me. Acosta reasoned that the people in the New World were primitive, and being a priest, he knew that all humans had died in a great flood, except for some who landed on a mountaintop in Central Asia. So they must have walked here somehow. Now, I didn't blame it all on people being primitive. He also said that he saw wolves in the New World, and only an idiot would put a wolf in a boat, so they must have walked here somehow. It sounded good to most scholars at the time, so we basically spent the next 400 years refining that story. We said 13,500 years ago, there are these half-naked men running around Siberia. I have to say that I put these two pictures up purposely. The one on the left is from a Russian publication, and the one on the right is from an American publication. Now, the Russians always make them sound, or look a little Vladimir Putin-esque here. We got a big bare-chested guy staring off in the distance with a club on his shoulder. And the American publications always made him kind of hunched over and hairy. Everyone we're talking about in this story is a modern human being, just like you, Homo sapiens. So I'm afraid the Russians are a little better at depicting this than we are. Well, we had to give a reason for these half-naked guys to be moving around Siberia. So it was decided they must be chasing mammoths. You know, this is my mammoth herd. They're highly mobile mammoth hunters. That's what we decided. And one day, they arrive at a bridge that connects Siberia and Alaska. We called it a land bridge. This is my land bridge here. And I guess they crossed it because the mammoths did, so they ultimately go through what's now Alaska and arrive at the Great Glaciers. This is one artist's depiction of what that edge would have looked like. The Cordilleran Glacier was going from the mountains to the sea. and the Laurentian Glacier covered still 5 million square miles of northern North America, up to 3 miles high. That's a pretty thick ice sheet. Apparently, they came at just the right moment. When I was in school, they never really told you what happened next. They just kind of skipped this. But I have a good imagination, so I'm picturing, Moses up there going, "Behold, an ice-free corridor and a 2,000-mile-long passageway between these 2 3-mile-high piles of ice appears." And these folks just go right on down through that, right? And when they get through this narrow corridor, they're really not the heroes of the story. There's some kind of Asian biker gang, and we say they kill everything they came across until 37 large animal species become extinct. It sounds a little silly when I tell it like that, doesn't it? With the exception of Charlton Heston there, that's exactly the story that we still teach in the 4th grade. So, okay, let's start over. I get 2nd graders out of Galt, and even 2nd graders know something about Siberia. Siberia is one of the coldest places on Earth, so no half-naked men. They're not all men either, but instead babies, teenagers, adults, grandma. They're not chasing mammoths. There's only about 17 mammoth kill sites in the Americas that we know of, and mammoths don't migrate east-west. There's no land bridge. There's a continent 1,600 miles wide called Beringia. A gap between 2 melting ice sheets would have a river, then lakes, then swamps, eventually some dry ground. And finally, we only have evidence for humans killing about 6 of the 37 large species that become extinct. My personal favorite is this one down in the lower right, the teratorn. It's a carnivorous bird, kills what it eats, with a 24-foot wingspan. And you are all Slim Jims. So, if you ever saw a 24-foot carnivorous bird, you'd remember that. So what are we saying? Some people walked in from Asia with some kind of primitive anti-aircraft weapon and killed all the teratorns? None of this makes any sense from start to finish. So in the 1970s, archaeologists working in southern Chile found the site called Monteverde. It's near Puerto Montt, Chile. And it dates to at least 14,800 years ago. There's some older strata in there that some of us don't have problems with, the 18.5, and then there's a real questionable one at 33.2. But this is on the other end of the continent, 1,000 years at least before we said people walked here from Asia. So we have a problem. And other sites were found that predated 13,500 years ago. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, Cactus Hill in Virginia, Miles Point in Delaware, and this site, Paisley Cave in Oregon, where they actually found 14,300-year-old coprolites. Now, we have to have a different word for everything as scientists, so if you aren't sure what a coprolite is, it's a turd. And you can complain about this site or that site and get really nitpicky about it, but a turd's a turd. You can actually date it because it's organic, and you can test the DNA from it and find it's from humans. And 14,300 years old, people were using this cave as a bathroom south of the glacial edge. So more and more sites have been found that support the fact, and it is now a fact, that people were here much earlier than we'd previously thought. This recent graphic shows many of them. It was first in National Geographic and then on Wikipedia, and it even includes the Galt site, which here they call Buttermilk Creek, which is actually a tributary of the Salado. And we appreciate being included in these graphics, even if they do put it in the wrong state. But, hey, you get what you get. The Galt site is actually located about 40 miles north of Austin, about 13 miles south of Killeen, just outside the central Texas town of Florence. It's been known to collectors since at least 1904 and to professional archaeologists since 1929. That's an extraordinary length of time for a site west of the Mississippi. The site was subject to both looting and collecting for almost 90 years. You can see some of those looters' holes in the pictures on the right and the bottom there. And you can see one of the early attempts of archaeologists to understand it in the upper left. The site is really remarkable for the surprises it has held for archaeologists. One of the first surprises we had were stones like this one here that had incised designs on them. These were hand-sized and somewhat smaller stones, and the ones that were found in the deepest layers of the site are the oldest dated art in the Americas. If you can't figure out how big this is, if you've forgotten your metric, if you work on one of our sites and you put an English measurement on one of our forms, we beat you within 2.54 centimeters of your life. So that scale at the bottom is about 2 inches. That gives you an idea. It's not a very large stone, but it's very complex design. We now have more than 200 of these in the lab, most of them with geological or geometrical patterns, rather. Stones like this are found on every continent except Antarctica, and they go back as far as 450,000 years ago to pre-human hominids. Many of the designs we see on these are actually part of the software of your frontal cortex. It's part of how we store and sort memories. So it's something we share with people all over the world. Our next surprise at Galt was the sheer quantity of archaeological material at the site. Over 10 years, the Galt School excavated approximately 3% of the site, and we brought 2.6 million artifacts back to the lab to study. A lot of that is debris, what's known as debitage in archaeology, that's from a large-scale tool manufacturing area. So this was like the Stanley Works of Central Texas. They were making tools like crazy here. We got a further surprise at the site when we came upon the lower mandible of a juvenile female Columbian mammoth. Now, that would have made a nice find in itself, but it was surrounded by 22 stone butchering tools and a Clovis point, and this makes it a probable mammoth kill site, one of only about 17 currently known in the Americas. Test excavations on another part of the site came across a slightly rectangular stone floor. It's not surprising if you don't want to go to sleep and wake up wet. If you're going to camp out in a valley in central Texas, you definitely want a drop cloth under your tent because that moisture wicks up every morning through the clay and will soak everything. But this particular floor is surrounded by a very non-random scatter of artifacts, including a flint knapping area to the north. It has an area filled with burned flakes, indicating a fire somewhere to the east of it. And there's an area way down in the southwest that has quite a bit of animal bone. This is their garbage. This data, among other things, indicates that this floor has a front and a back, and therefore it has a structure on top of it. The tool technology and dates tells us that this is at least 12,700 years old and perhaps older, making this the oldest excavated house in North America. And certainly not something you'd have if you're a half-naked guy running across the landscape. This is something you build if you're staying put for a while. The last surprise we had at Galt was a really big one. In 2002, we were winding up some of our excavations and actually leaving the site for a while. And one of our staff, Sam Gardner, who's shown here, was clearing a profile following the water table as it went down. He'd dig until he hit water, and you could see water at the bottom of the hole there. We'd wait a couple of days. It would dry up. He'd dig a little bit lower. And at the very bottom of this test unit, he ran into Clovis age artifacts, stuffed below that line on the artifacts on the left-hand side. Those we used to think represented the first peoples in the Americas. 13,500 years ago till about 12,700 years ago. But down below the Clovis artifacts, he kept finding more stone tools and debris that predated the Clovis culture. So in 2007, after acquiring the site and donating it to the Archaeological Conservancy, we excavated some very quick test holes to show visiting archaeologists the geology of the site. The largest gathering of archaeologists in the world, the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting, was in Austin for the first time ever that year. I can tell you from sad experience that 5,000 archaeologists on 6th Street is not a good idea, but they liked it so much they came back in 2014 and they were supposed to come back this year, but unfortunately the pandemic called off the meeting. In digging this test unit, we again found artifacts, some almost 3 feet below the Clovis strata. So after the archaeologists left, we raised a stress skin building over the area and we began to remove the mixed surface soils. This area had a lot of beer cans and cigarette wrappers and rusty tools that people had left there over the years as they dug. This, by the way, my staff says is one of the few pictures of me working. But we actually didn't get very far across the area we wanted to excavate before we started finding artifacts exactly where they were supposed to be. It wasn't all looted. We say curse their inefficiency because the record was held by one unit that was 1 meter square, so a little over 3 feet square, and 4 centimeters deep, so about 2 inches deep. And the 2 young women digging that had 16,683 flakes. Every one of those flakes larger than a quarter, we get its exact position on Earth with a laser system. We write all that information on a permanent tag and put it inside a bag. We write all that information on the bag. We map it on our clipboard. We write all that information on our clipboard. We write all that information on an artifacts removed chart. We write all that information on a photographic log. We write all that information on a dry erase board. We get a north arrow and a camera and take a picture of it and remove it and put it in the bag. 16,000 times. It took the 2 young women digging that 2 months to dig down just 4 centimeters, 2 inches. So there was that much stuff in that place. We ended up excavating a 58 square meter unit designed to step down twice. It was designed to expose 12 square meters on the underlying bedrock to see what was there. The stone circles you see, there's one right in the foreground and one kind of in the middle there, are actually 4,000 to 8,000 year old stone ovens. We're responsible for all archaeology, even though the Galt School is interested in the peopling of the Americas, the oldest stuff. So these guys had left these stone ovens right in the middle of our excavation area like a bullseye, like they knew we wanted to dig there. This took us a long time to get around. This is why it took 7 years to dig to the bottom. We finally reached the bottom in 2013 to begin with. We finished it in 2015. It was a very impressive hole to look at. And even more so when you realize that we do microscopic use-wear analysis on the stone tools. That is, we look at the edges of them under high-powered microscopes. And those tools will tell us what material they were used on and in what direction. So we can tell the difference between, bone working and woodworking and meat work cutting and grass cutting and hide working. All those things show up differently. Because we do that microscopic use-wear analysis, we can't use steel tools around the stone tools because the material these stone tools are made of, chert, is stronger than steel. So steel leaves a silver streak on it. That means that this hole was excavated by volunteers and staff using chopsticks and bamboo splinters. Now it's a very impressive hole, I hope. This is actually the bedrock at the very bottom, and we did find what we were looking for. We found more than 130,000 tools and the debris from making tools that date between 16 and 20,000 years ago. Even the bedrock here has a story to tell. The grooves in the bedrock, you can see there's 2 really deep ones down the very low left corner that go almost straight up and down, then a bunch of diagonal ones in the middle going off to your upper right, and then some really shallow ones way up in the upper left that are just starting. And that tells us this is the outer bend of Buttermilk Creek. It was flowing through this area, and it was cutting outward to the upper left in this picture. And people were on the point bar in that bend, and they were butchering the extinct horse. One of the extinct horses in Texas was Equus scotti, about the size of a middle-sized modern horse. You can see the teeth down there in the mud of one of these horses. The bone that held them is long since gone, but the teeth are all still in order on the jaw. The Galt site, which has abundant stone and water resources as well as readily available foods, was popular throughout time. There are 22 archaeological cultures that you could find on a central Texas site, and we not only have 22, but a culture even earlier we've not yet named. I mean, I've been arguing for the Clark culture, but I'm not getting anywhere on that. But you got to try, I think. Some of these stone tools left behind by the earliest Texans are very familiar to us, and some are significantly different, as would be expected if there was a tool style prior to Clovis. The projectile points we found down there are unlike anything we've seen before. On your left is a Clovis point, and that's what they should look like. It's called a lancelet point, long parallel-sided thing. And on your right are 3 points that were found 14 feet underground. And they're not very big, only about 3/4 of an inch long. If you'd like to see one of these in person, one of them is now at the Bullock State History Museum and is the very first case as you enter in their Becoming Texas exhibit. Our colleagues liked Austin so much, they came back for a return bout in 2014, and we hosted busloads of them at the site. This is what a horde of archaeologists looks like. They asked a lot of questions, but they seemed satisfied by what they'd seen and the answers we'd given them. So in July of 2018, we published this article in Science Advances, one of the premier science publications in the world. And it details the geology, stratigraphy, and the dating of the Gault site, showing that we have human artifacts that are unquestionably 16 to 20,000 years old in Texas. The news was quickly picked up internationally by electronic and print media, first in the United States, then like the Daily Mail in Great Britain. That didn't surprise us. I mean, we almost speak the same language, so they picked it up pretty quickly. But then what did surprise us was shortly after that, articles were written in magazines and newspapers and online throughout the world. In fact, there's more interest and knowledge about this subject outside the U.S. than there is inside the U.S. One of the first publications we saw was the leading newspaper in Santiago, Chile. Now, they had been very upset when Monteverde was first discovered because, of course, North American archaeologists kind of dissed it and said, well, probably not. It's South America. So they wrote an article that talked about Monteverde and Gault that you could pretty much sum up by, "We told you so." So since 2015, we've spent a lot of time in the lab writing up our findings from this incredible archaeological site. For every day in the field for an archaeologist, there's about 40 days in the lab. That's actually what we normally do rather than scrape the dirt. And because it's much harder to figure out what it means than it is to dig it up. Currently, we hope to have a draft of a book about the Clovis and older than Clovis components at the Gault site done before the end of this year and off to the publisher. You probably wouldn't see it in print for about another 2 years. It will get reviewed and edited and everything else. The Gault School of Archaeological Research is a nonprofit interested in research and education regarding the peopling of the Americas, not the people of Texas. So we actually keep busy with a lot of other projects. We've worked on early man sites from Oaxaca, Mexico, a possible mammoth kill site in Guatemala. We searched for underwater sites in the Gulf of Mexico. We examine about 10 sites a year here in Texas. We did lithic analysis on an early man site called Huaca Prieta in Peru. And volunteers and Gault School members are always out there testing another site, hoping to find deeply buried archaeology that confirms what we found at Gault. Archaeologists are interested in patterns, so we need more than one individual site to figure out what's going on. If you'd like to find out more about our work, we have an extensive website at www.galtschool.org. And the Galt School is a nonprofit, and we're dependent on grants, memberships, and donations from people like you who are both interested in what the past can tell us and sometimes wish to participate in our discoveries. So there's more information on our website on how you can join us in our mission and volunteer in our programs. So with that, I'm going to thank you for inviting me today, and we have lots of time for questions. So I'll quit sharing this PowerPoint and we'll see what you might want to ask me.
So far, we don't have any questions yet.
No questions out there at all. Everybody knows this subject. Come on, I know somebody has a question they always wanted to ask an archaeologist. Oh, I don't have your audio there.
Got it. Thank you.
There you go.
I'm always fascinated that, you know, you're digging, and then you find these tools. What is it that's putting it so down? Is the earth just sand, volcanic ash? What's happening that's making it go so low?
That's a question I get asked all the time. Why is it buried? Okay, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's on the surface. That doesn't help us much because it's out of context. If it's on the surface, it might be mixed with stuff from the last 20,000 years, and I wouldn't be able to tell. So I have to look for buried archaeology to really tell me something. It's got to be protected from everything else. In the case of the Galt site, we have flood deposits, we have sheet wash that comes down the valley walls, and here in Texas, we have a pretty significant aeolian, windborne component. During hurricane season, we get those lovely purple sunsets. That's sand from the Sahara in Africa that's blowing in our atmosphere. And it's falling on us all hurricane season. And late in the spring, we get those orange sunsets. That's sand coming from the other direction. We usually blame it on the burning season down south when people are burning off farmland, but it's also Arizona, New Mexico, and Baja California.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I woke up one morning and I live just outside of Austin, and I had a 1/4 inch of dust on my car from a sandstorm we had in Austin.
Wow.
So imagine that over 20,000 years.
Yes. Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Galt was in a unique place to preserve that. It has a fairly wide valley, so the water that rushes in there from the headwaters of the creek spread out in that wide valley, slow down, and drop what they're carrying. And they've been doing that for about 20,000 years and burying archaeology.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Good question.
Lee?
Yeah, we have a few questions now. Lori Purser says, are tours available during this time?
Tours are available. We have monthly scheduled tours. We're keeping them a little smaller than we normally had. There is an events calendar on the first page of the Galt School website that shows the schedule for those monthly scheduled tours. Those are actually coordinated for us alternate months by the Williamson and Bell County Museums. We also will schedule a tour for any group of 10 or more. Our scheduled tours are usually on a Saturday. The other ones can be anywhere from Monday to Saturday, depending on our schedule. So, yeah, always available.
Okay. The next one says, any new digs going on at the Galt site?
No, we're actually done excavating at the Galt site. Like I said, we excavated 3% of that site, and we have 2.6 million artifacts. And remember, for every day in the field, about 40 days in the lab, and then take a staff of 7 and divide 2.6 million by that. So there's more than we're ever going to handle. We have already had 16 master's theses and 7 doctoral dissertations written about the stuff that our staff isn't interested in. We pass it on to grad students and say, here, run with this question. And people will be looking at it for the next 50, 60 years, getting new information out of it. So excavating more at the Galt site statistically would likely give me more of the same. And what I really need is a pattern. So we've been testing lots of sites in the Central Texas area because we need to find another site with the same kind of dates, the same kind of tools, and then we can start talking about a culture.
Yeah, that was my next question. What have you, if any, come up with about our early people? Foraging, you said there was a house, so they must have been hurting.
Yeah, they're broad spectrum hunters and gatherers. And this shouldn't come as a surprise, because so have all humans been. Modern human beings have never subsisted by big game hunting alone. You can't. It just doesn't work. So they eat everything that's available. So, here in Central Texas, they're eating deer and turkeys and rabbits. They aren't actually going after the extinct bison or horse or mammoth very often. In fact, one of the things we find on almost every single Clovis site is turtle. We have hundreds of sites with turtle shell and burned turtle shell. I mean, for God's sakes, they come in their own bowl. But it would look really stupid for us to show in the textbooks 15 half-naked guys poking a turtle. So we always show 15 half-naked guys poking a mammoth. But they're eating a lot more turtle than they are mammoths. A 5-year-old could pick up a turtle. You don't need to be a great hunter.
Yes, but that 5-year-old probably won't eat it.
They were less picky.
Okay, our next question is, do you still accept volunteers?
Yes, we do still accept volunteers. We haven't really had much going on during the pandemic. Our lab is on the grounds of University of Texas's research campus, and we aren't allowed to have anyone that's non-UT. So no one who doesn't have a UT affiliation can come in yet. We are just starting to do some surveys because we can be outside and spread out. And we do have information on volunteering on our website. There's a little sheet that you fill out on there that gives us the information. The field folks that are going out have basically a call out list. They have your email. They send out a call that says, on these days, we're going to be working in this area. And if you can make it one of those days, you reply and they send you the details.
Do you bring your own chopsticks to dig, or
we have tools if you don't have them, and no experience is required. We can teach you. Digging is actually the easiest part of archaeology. That's why we can use lots of volunteers.
Okay.
How does the Horn Rock Shelter, how's it related to the Galt site?
Oh, interesting. Well, Horn Rock Shelter is not as old as Galt, but it does have the burial of a man and child that are two of the oldest bodies we have in the New World. We only have right now 17 human skeletons that are older than 9,000 years old. The oldest one is only about 14,000. So we still don't know much about the earliest peoples in the Americas. You got to try and extrapolate from thousands of years later. But Horn Rock Shelter and also the burial of a young woman from Wilson Leonard near Leander are actually 3 out of those 17. So Texas has some of the best physical evidence for early peoples in the Americas, but those are actually a little less than Clovis age. So.
Wow.
Yeah, human beings don't last well in the environment.
Yeah. That was one of my questions. Do you mainly get like tools and pottery, or is that long disintegrated?
Pottery is something you use if you either practice or deal frequently with people who practice agriculture or have maritime activities. So we have pottery along the coast where people are fishing and so on. And we have pottery around the periphery of Texas where people practiced agriculture. But in Central Texas, it's not a great place for agriculture. And even if you're only moving seasonally, you might move from, say, Galt down to, one of the rivers because the fish are spawning. Pottery is not a thing you want to haul around. It's fragile and it's heavy. So they know about it. We do occasionally find bits, but not much.
How hard is bedrock, and what could we compare it to?
Well, at Galt, it depends on where you are. One of our valleys, the bedrock's down about 10 feet. In another place, it's down 14. In most of the Edwards Plateau, if you look on Google Earth, you'll see it shining out right from the surface. You'll see rock. I mean, that's bedrock, and there isn't a lot of dirt on a lot of the Edwards Plateau. So what you usually see is Edwards limestone all over, those big white patches of rock shining through our bedrock. So it all depends on where you are. If you get further and further toward the coast, where more and more stuff is washed, bedrock can be very, very deep. Even if I wanted to look for a soil that was 10,000 years or more old, to look for Paleo-Indian activities, say in Louisiana, I'd be looking 150 feet down, because the Mississippi carries a lot of dirt. And it's just been piling up down there in southern Louisiana. So that's why they have almost no evidence of Paleo-Indian in southern Louisiana. It may be there. It's just we can't get to it. We just don't have the ability to dig 150 feet down.
Do you have an age limit on volunteers?
Do I have an age limit? Well, I got to say, we have in the past accepted some high school students as long as they came accompanied by a parent. One of my high school students actually not only went to college early, but graduated with a master's just a couple of years ago. And she started with us when she was very young, but she had a parent come with her. Generally, we take college students on up. My oldest volunteer was 92 when he told me that he had trouble bending over, so he couldn't excavate, so he'd work on the screens. I told him at 92 he didn't apologize to me. So that's pretty much, high school to in your 90s if you're still able. That's it.
That's great. Any other questions? I have a question.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead, Lee.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
I have a question. I moved in this area about a little over a year ago, and I've heard people say that the clean area was a lake. Do you have evidence that this area was water?
Yeah, there was water, but it wasn't a lake. All that limestone is uplifted seabed. That's what limestone is. That's why you see all the little shell fossils in the limestone.
Mm-hmm.
It's ancient seabed. Now it's uplifted, so the sea wasn't this high. That rock was significantly lower in the past, and it was long before humans were around. The Edwards Plateau stuff is about 150 million years old, but that is ancient seabed. I had somebody ask me not long ago if there was any archaeological sites in Killeen, and it's interesting because particularly in Bell County, because you have two large reservoirs and a huge federal reservation, Fort Hood, by law, they're required to do archaeology. So there are actually hundreds of sites recorded in Bell County.
Oh.
Lots of them in Killeen. Yeah.
Can we, where do we find that? Online?
You won't.
Oh, okay. All right.
There's a state data site that you have to be registered to be able to use. Okay. We certainly don't want to encourage looting. That's what archaeologists use when they're going into an area they haven't been into before. They look at that map and see what else has been done in that area, what kind of archaeology people have seen in that time. And a lot of those sites no longer exist. There are no laws in the United States regarding archaeology on private property except burial laws. So even though archaeologists may have recorded it and written a little report, it might have gotten bulldozed afterward and be gone.
That's a shame.
Yeah, it happens quite often.
Have you conducted any potential sites in Mills, Hamilton County? Sorry.
Yeah, actually, we've had a crew working up in Hamilton County for some time, actually. It's kind of funny because the local newspapers up there are really starved for news. So every time our field director, Dr. Steve Howard, goes up there, they say, archaeologist returns to Central Texas. Steve's from Austin, so I guess he's always been here, but I guess they don't regard that as Central Texas. But yeah, we've had programs up there with oftentimes 20 to 30 volunteers from the area working with us. I think we still have 15 to 20 ranches on the waiting list from talks we've given up there that people said, we would like you to look on our property. We have to be invited in. So, you know, if a rancher invites us in, they get on the list and eventually we get to them and take a look.
That's cool.
Yeah.
What about backyards? No.
Oh, it can happen in backyards. I've been in backyards. I've been in all kinds. I get all the time emailed and texted pictures. We're happy to take a look at pictures and tell you what we see. We do ask people to please, for God's sakes, make sure they're in focus. I get a lot of brown fuzzy blobs that people send me, and I say it's a brown fuzzy blob. And I'll admit, a lot of the stuff that people send us are rocks, unusual looking rocks. And they say, well, obviously this is something. And say, well, you know, unfortunately not. Particularly solution rounded limestone, which comes in all kinds of unusual shapes and sizes. We have a collection in the lab. We have Howard the Duck, and we have the Galt from Caddyshack, and several other lovely looking sculptures, but they're natural. But every once in a while, somebody sends me a picture, and we had a gentleman actually up in Hamilton County send us a picture of one of the most beautiful Clovis points I've ever seen in my life. He actually took a picture of where he found it in the edge of his creek with a tape measure measuring from the surface down to that and flagging tape showing where the point had come from, and then said, is this important? And we said, can we come up and take a look? Unfortunately, we couldn't find an extent site, but we did show him where to watch, and he's actually actively watching his creek during floods and everything to see if it eventually eats into a site, and he'll call us. You know, so
that's cool.
That's where we get a lot of our leads, is people just saying, what is this?
Have you found any promising leads for another pre-Clovis site in Texas?
I get them all the time. Unfortunately, as we say in the office, we have to kiss a lot of frogs. So 2 weeks ago, I went out on a site we thought was very, very promising. It looked almost identical to Galt on the surface. The geology was very similar. It had a creek running through it. It had archaeology scattered all over the surface, but we dug down and it had pretty shallow bedrock, and all the archaeology was 8,000 years or less. I was actually on a survey yesterday where we looked at a promising area, and I think, well, pretty much all of us walking all day yesterday found one flake, which means not a very promising area. But, you know, you have to look. So, yeah, we just keep testing and hoping, you know, we use the best of our knowledge to look at the geology of a site, the ages of certain soils, things like that, to try and determine if it's a good candidate. But then you have to dig a hole. And you may or may not find anything.
Since the site is close to inner space caverns, is it possible that the caverns may hold Clovis artifacts as well?
We have never seen any human artifacts in inner space. They did excavations there. In fact, the excavations were led by Emeritus Professor Ernie Lundelius from the UT Vertebrate Paleontology Lab. The final cavern that they take you to in inner space cavern, the large opening there, was once a sinkhole. And there's actually a column of stuff that goes towards the ceiling that is the fill from that sinkhole. And they have mammoths and horse and a couple other critters that washed in there, but no signs of humans. That sinkhole probably filled prior to humans arriving in Texas. Same thing goes for Waco Mammoth, if anybody's interested. The mammoths at Waco Mammoths predate humans in Texas, at least as we know it now, about 65,000 years ago. And you could go to that and walk over the dig site and see some of the mammoths in place. They also have saber-toothed tiger and camelops, so an early camel, things like that.
I have another question. I mean, I know that archaeology is science. I'm just fascinated that you can say, okay, this was 15,000 years ago. This is 33,000 years ago. Can you learn that taking? I mean, you learned that in school?
It's lots and lots of scientific dating. Now, there are some things. We do dating in two different ways. We do relative dating and we do absolute dating. So if you go into a house and you see that the bathroom and the kitchen are pink and white and black, you know that that house hasn't been remodeled since the 50s, early 60s.
Right.
And then you see avocado appliances and harvest gold appliances and almond, white, stainless steel, black, stainless steel again. So if we go to a house with an avocado appliance in it, we know exactly how old that is, right? That's relative dating.
Right.
Nobody ever asked me what happened to the avocado appliance people. But people ask me all the time, what happened to the Clovis people? We're not talking about people. Archaeologists are looking at stuff. So the people who had avocado appliances, they know who they are. They became harvest gold people or whatever. Same thing happens with that. So relative dating, for instance, we have lots and lots of projectile point styles that change through time, just like appliance colors. So if I find a Clovis point in good context, I know because of hundreds of sites that have been dated that that's going to date somewhere between 12,700 and 13,500 years old.
Okay.
Now, absolute dating are the scientific methods we use to get calendar dates. It's how we establish some of those relative dates. And we use things like thermoluminescence, which looks at burn chert, paleomagnetism, which looks at where the Earth's magnetic pole was in the past. We use radiocarbon dating, which most people have heard of. We use, at Galt, we used a lot of optically stimulated luminescence, which actually looks at tiny little particles of quartz and feldspar in the soil, the clear grains you see in a handful of sand, and they tell us when they last saw the sun.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's people developing new methods of dating using other kinds of isotopes that we know a lot about. I know the Chinese have just been experimenting with one that has great promise, that dates things a lot older than we can do with radiocarbon dating. So we use multiple methods. We want to use relative dating and absolute dating, and we want to use as many as we can in any circumstance, and we want them all to agree. And then we can, with confidence, say, this is around 12,700 years old.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, we don't do that stuff in-house. There's guys in nuclear labs that do that stuff for us.
Wow. Yeah, I was always amazed by that. It's like, what are y'all doing? Picking a number?
Yeah.
I knew you had science involved. I just didn't know what.
Lots of hard science. Archaeology uses, as Dr. Collins said in the film, uses methods and tools from almost every science known. They very rarely invent those things for archaeology. There's just no market for it, right? So we borrow them from other sciences, and all of it is hard science. We do things like that nuclear dating, and we do soil chemistry, and we do laser scanning, and we do all of this stuff. But the end result of archaeology is a story that goes into the history books. So unfortunately, archaeology gets stuck in the humanities, even though the entire process is hard science. So for instance, I'm not eligible for STEM funding. Dr. Collins, when he was 12 years old, started the Midland Archaeological Society that still exists today because he wanted to start an archaeology club, and his principal told him he couldn't because it wasn't a real science.
Wow.
So that's not a new thing that people feel that way. If I stood up in a school board meeting and said, we made a decision and we're not going to teach your kids archaeology anymore to save money, I think everybody would go, yeah, okay, no problem. If I stood up in that same school board meeting and said, we're not going to teach history anymore, even the people that hated history in school would complain because they know it's important somehow. But a good deal of what you're learning is not history, it's archaeology.
Yes.
History strictly is the written word and firsthand accounts, which are colored by all kinds of biases and may or may not be the truth of what happened.
Right. No, that's amazing. That I agree with you. This is anthropology. This is, our story and our proof of our story.
Yeah.
So.
The United States and Canada are the only places where archaeology is part of anthropology as a whole, the study of man. And that's why it gets thrown in the humanities. Mm-hmm. Everywhere else in the world, archaeology is a separate discipline. It's usually closely allied with geology and history. but it's considered to be a science everywhere in the world but here. Because since they put us in anthropology, and sociocultural anthropology are definitely a humanity, you know, study modern peoples. So, yeah.
Do we have more questions, Lee?
Not at the moment, no.
And I just looked at the time. We could just talk to you forever. Dr. Wernicke,
We can have them come out to Galt and they can talk to me.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And you know, go onto his website, or if you want to ask the librarians, we will give you lots of links to you, because you have so much information that it's just fascinating. It's very, very fascinating. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Clark Wernicke. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lee.
Bye, everybody.
We are going to make sure that if you want credit for it, you go ahead and register on the library's website under events. And that way we have a name that we don't have proof you were here, but we have a name that you were here. So, thank you. Thank you again. And our next virtual is tonight at 6 o'clock on the library's YouTube. We have a virtual poetry slam, and the winners are going to be announced at 7 o'clock. And next Tuesday, we have Dr. Adam C. That's going to talk to us about the Buchenwald stories concerning the Holocaust. So hopefully we see you guys again. Thank you. And have the good rest of the day. And don't leave, Dr. Clark.